の城スーパーロボットマジンガー Z 無敵の力は僕らのために
With this podcast, Koji, you could become either a god or a devil. Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of Super Audio Robo Podcast Z. It's the show where we give you recommendations on the finest mecha content for your cultural and artistic development.
And believe me, you'll be thanking us by the end of this. You'll all have learned something new and your life will improve afterwards.
You might even learn something new even if you thought you already knew about this, because we're covering, to start this episode, this whole podcast really, we've got like some history that needs to be covered regarding, you know, very important franchises, like series that are so big, it would be a disservice if we just cherry-picked one entry out of the lineup without giving you an idea of like what the greater whole is. And that is Mazinger Z, the franchise, the anime, the manga, the giant robot juggernaut that essentially codified like the mecha franchise as we have known it since the 70s. At the very least, the super robot subgenre.
Yeah, and even if it is just the super robot genre, if you ever wondered where all those tropes came from, the rocket punches, the monster of the weeks, all of those things, they all started from here.
Everything from 72 onwards in relation to giant robots would not exist the way you know it without Mazinger.
Even shows like Gundam, in a way, kind of owe their existence to Mazinger.
Oh yeah, and Gundam's another big one, but you all at home will have to wait till the next episode directly after this. Of course, a giant robot show like this would not pass up the opportunity to talk about Gundam's legacy. But for now, this is Mazinger's legacy.
Hell yeah.
And for the uninitiated, we gotta answer the question: what the fuck is a Mazinger?
Yeah, please explain what Mazinger is, because I believe, as influential as this show is, it doesn't have much impact in the West.
Yes, it's not as immediately recognizable as a name in, like, the mainstream surface level, which Gundam has obviously had the popularity, you know, by contrast, to actually get to that point. So to explain Mazinger, we obviously gotta first start with the basic synopsis of what it was all about, story-wise, and it goes like this. Koji Kabuto is a Japanese high school student who one day inherits the final legacy of his grandfather, Dr. Juzo Kabuto. It is a giant robot made of super alloy Z called Mazinger Z. Its power is such that Juzo tells his grandson that the world's about to be attacked by an evil man known as Dr. Hell, and with Mazinger's power he can use it to either save the world or destroy it. And so Koji vows to use Mazinger for good and fights the forces of Dr. Hell with the help of the Photon Power Labs and his closest friends. Sounds pretty typical, you know, kind of superhero-sounding shit, except instead of capes, it's a giant robot.
Yeah, pretty much. The TV show is as basic as it gets. The everything afterwards is a completely different ballgame.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because again, we're talking about something from the 70s, you know, like this is already over 50 years old. Like it's got quite a legacy. So we got to go back, actually. We need to get into some prehistory regarding Mazinger, how it came to be. And it starts with its creator, everyone's favorite weird old anime uncle, Go Nagai.
Yeah, believe me, this guy's he's a character, all right.
Oh, he's a fucking treasure. Like, everyone calls Osamu Tezuka the father of anime and manga. Go Nagai is the cool uncle who will give you sips of his alcohol and tell you all the wildest stories at family reunions.
And then there's Tomino, but we'll get to Tomino in the next episode.
Yeah, we got another funny family-related analogy to assign to him, but that's another time. But right now, who Go Nagai is... You know, he started out as a mangaka in 1967, was born in 45. Funny anecdote regarding his decision to get into creating manga is that he got what was essentially a cancer scare after he was bleeding out of his ass as a kid, until he actually got it diagnosed properly from the doctor and was like, no, it's not cancer, you idiot, just take this fucking medicine. And then he realized that after he had gotten the proper diagnosis and realized he wasn't going to die of cancer, that he had already made his decision to become a mangaka. And that's how he got to where he is today. Don't you just love this man?
Even his origin story is just so... him, like you already described him as as like the crazy uncle, and that's as apt as it gets with him.
And it even then, like when you describe it the way that I did, it comes off a lot like the premises in a lot of his early manga, because he was known for, doing, as was the style for the time for a lot of manga authors, gag manga, stuff that was designed to, like, get a laugh out of you. Except his way of making gag manga was to push stuff that by 60s Japan standards are, let's just say, a bit taboo, a bit controversial. Like, his most famous work during this time was a manga known as Harenshi Gakuen, Shameless School. It was one of his earliest successes, despite getting a whole lot of flack from, like, moral guardians and, like, parent-teacher associations over the idea that this manga for kids is showing such shameless things, such debaucherous acts, like peeking in the girls' locker room. Stuff that, like, in the grand scheme of, like, real skeevy stuff, seems kind of old hat compared to the kind of bad shit that we've kind of escalated to in the intervening decades.
Yeah, but back then it was, like you said, it was pretty shocking because here's the other thing you'll quickly realize about Go Nagai. Guy's kind of a huge pervert.
Yes. There's been an urban legend about it I've always heard. I don't know if there was ever any validity to it. I think the only thing to go off on is that he's technically not married.
Oh.
But I think there was always like a joke about how his editors were adamant about making sure he was kept a virgin so that his ideas would get more and more fucked up.
Well, considering that the stuff he made, because if all of you old heads out there, the ones who have watched those old, like, violent OVAs back in the 90s, if you've watched the little show called Violence Jack, you should thank Go Nagai for that one, because he was the original creator of that shit.
Yeah. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves on
sorry.
that, since, this is still the 60s. A Shameless School, successful as it was infamous, and it was through that Go Nagai, with the help of his brothers and close friends, was able to form his own publishing company, That's a pretty big deal, especially, like, this early on in his career, being able to essentially have his own company where he could, like, basically obtain more control over his own creations, which would lead to all kinds of different things, including Mazinger Z. So, like, where did the concept come from? Well, another funny story that could only have been, like, just come up with on a whim by someone like Go Nagai himself was in a moment of him observing a traffic jam and wondering, man, how great would it be if I could just bypass this shit entirely with a robot? Just fly over it.
Let's be honest, who among us hasn't had that thought every once in a while?
I think most of us in a traffic jam usually have the desire to, like, want to just crush and destroy everything in our path, but flying over it, that's definitely an approach. But that is important to realize that it was flying over with a robot, because at this point in anime and manga history, like, robots had already existed as, like, a fictional concept, but they were usually in, like, two forms. You either had artificial humanoids that were, like, human-sized, pass off and behave like humans, like Astro Boy, classic example. You want to go with live action as well. I believe around this time, Android Kikaider was also on television at the time, which is a similar idea. But then the other end, you had giant robots before, but they were remote controlled by a human externally. Stuff like, the original Tetsujin 28, as well as Giant Robo, both of which by the same author. However, none had existed at this point that were directly piloted from within a cockpit. This is the important thing to, like, understand, and how it leads to Mazinger's, like, influence being as strong as it was.
This is the first time anything's like that, like an actual pilot is in the mecha for this one. And ever since then, that's just how it's been.
Which is kind of a shame, because I personally like the idea of remote control robots as, like, an alternative, and you don't see those nearly explored as often enough. But, as far as other ideas that came to Go Nagai when trying to land on the final design for Mazinger Z, there was an original name for it prior called Inaugural Z. An interesting thing as well that kind of highlights how some of the decisions were influenced, or at least designed to, like, run in contrast to what was popular at the time. As part of the piloting mechanism for Inaugural Z is that its cockpit would have involved a motorcycle that attaches to the head. However, this would not stay as a motorcycle because this was the early 70s and Kamen Rider had recently come on TV and was a huge success. To the point that like it basically added to the popularity of motorcycles as like the vehicle of choice for your protagonist. You know, if you wanted, like, if you're creating something like a piece of fiction in Japan in the 70s and you wanted something that was like trendy and showing just how cool of a badass your character was, he had to ride a motorcycle.
Yeah, also, it might have been a scrap design, but they still kind of kept it. It's like, if you look it up, it looks so different than the Mazinger we got nowadays. Here's another fun fact. They actually made models for this thing, too.
Props of being an influential franchise that's been around for like half a century at this point.
Yeah.
You build up enough of a legacy, you can get away with like some deep fucking pulls.
Yeah, and the real ones, the people who know, like us, who know way too much, will point at it.
Too much.
We know too much, y'all. Holy moly.
But that's okay, because us knowing as much as we do, just our passion for this is obviously going to be rubbing off on you at home so that you'll want to like, dig in deeper.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're not scaring you away.
No, please.
Hopefully.
No, please. We want you to know how cool these shows are. I'm shaking
Yeah.
you at home.
Be me.
Be me.
Damn it. So, the final part to cover with this prehistory is it's based in, you know, obviously like the kind of the history and background of like the years leading up to Mazinger, but also this is going to be partly like conjecture and theorizing on my part, because this has to get into like the question that I think a lot of people these days, we were not born like early enough to have watched this in the 70s. We we have no idea what it was actually like on the ground floor for when the original anime and manga first came out and like became the sensation it did in Japan. So like I've been like thinking a lot over like the past few years as to like how Mazinger was so able to quickly get the foothold that it did upon its introduction. And it's important to look back at what the pop culture landscape was like in Japan back in like the late 60s to early 70s. Like around this time, tokusatsu TV shows, hero shows specifically, like Ultraman, and, you know, around this time as well, Kamen Rider, had become quite popular. Like, it was the live-action shows that were, like, providing a steady, like, combination of, like, character drama with fantastical action to them. I mean, fucking Ultraman is literally an alien being that, like, grows to gigantic size in order to get into a basically just a gigantic wrestling match with a kaiju. It's awesome.
Yeah.
No one in Japan had seen anything like that, so of course audiences were very enamored with it. Whereas anime and manga, for the most part, were like they were in that position that I feel like that the West overall has been in for a lot longer, and in some circles you could say is still in, which is the dismissive idea that this is a medium for children. Like, it's not something that can be seen as a serious, you know, medium for works of art.
Yeah, like it hasn't blown up yet as it has now in some places. It's kind of a shame.
Yeah, and to add to where Go Nagai was at this time, as we mentioned before, when he started, he was doing gag mangas. But admittedly, gag manga that was like very controversial in its subject matter. But even by the time the 70s was rolling around, he was starting to shift towards, you know, like trying to like do what these tokusatsu shows were already doing, which is to up the character drama and action while still providing visuals and concepts that really could only ever exist and be done justice in the medium they were working in, which in this case is, you know, printed comic book panels. And that leads to Go Nagai creating his other most defining work, arguably his magnum opus, Devilman.
Oh, yeah.
It also had an anime, but really anyone that's in the know understands that, like, the manga is where it's at as far as, like, being his life's work.
Yeah, and some people should be at least familiar with it because of Devilman Crybaby when that came out.
Oh yeah, like that was a big deal as far as, you know, just being a celebration of Go Nagai's, you know, entire career up to that point, being a mangaka for 50 years.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing as well, getting back to what I was saying about theorizing as to what would lead to Mazinger getting a foothold in, like, the popular consciousness. He was not a direct part of it, But I feel that Go Nagai's penchant for pushing boundaries in the media he worked in ran parallel with like another element that was going on in the manga industry called the Gekiga movement, which, for those that are especially not familiar with like their history on anime and manga, the Gekiga movement was a mission statement from several manga authors at the time where they wanted to break away, explicitly so, from the mainstream trend of like very whimsical gag manga to making more complex, mature stories, like comics that were meant for adults. Like that, something that would help it be seen more as a legitimate form of art. Like, and if you want to know, like, if this still seems kind of unfamiliar to you and you want a good example of what counts as a Gekiga manga, or just Gekiga in general, because the word Gekiga was chosen explicitly to kind of in a similar way to how, like, in the Western part of the world, graphic novels for a time was pushed as, like, an alternative name for comics to make it seem more like something that could be taken more seriously. But, like, I would say, like, a good example of a Gekiga that had a lot of staying power even after the movement had died was Golgo 13.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, anyone that knows about Golgo 13 but doesn't know about the Gekiga movement in general, it's like you can now, like, you can look at what that manga was about, trace it back to its origins, and be like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense where it came from.
And also, like, as you mentioned before, Golgo 13 is still going on today, even after the author has passed away.
Yeah. He's got like a strong like assortment of assistants that are continuing the legacy for him even afterwards. Like they never even missed a deadline, I think, until COVID happened, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of become like just a manga for salarymen in a way, but it's kind of still impressive. It's still going on.
So when you look at that, like, Go Nagai's penchant for like pushing beyond just like making like silly manga for kids. The introduction of like tokusatsu live action shows that were like combining over the top action with character drama, and then obviously the Gekiga movement trying to like push for like manga to be seen as a more legitimate form of art. This gets into what I feel is an important thing to understand when you look at these things in a historical context, is that things that are successful, the things that are able to find success are when they are able to tap into a desire, a need, a sort of demand that is not known to people yet at the time. And that demand is something that is shared between both the audiences that consume it and the creators themselves who are like trying to bring it to fruition in the first place.
Yeah.
I think like all these elements running, not even if they're not feeding into each other directly or like giving direct inspiration, them running in parallel at least is fueling the desire for audiences to be like, we want these whimsical images, which I believe is where the word manga is derived from, and all these anime, we want to see it grow.
Yeah.
And similarly, the creators wanted it to grow. Toei was pretty big on that as well, because like if they didn't have like a stable of like new cartoons that could help it grow, anime was not going to have a future.
No.
It was not going to become the eventual juggernaut that would spread overseas at the turn of the millennium like it did for us, for our generation.
It would have ended up being like what cartoons are, or what animation is in the West right now, where it's made either for an all ages or more for kids.
Anything that could have been more adult leaning would have remained like super niche and underground.
Yeah, and it's funny when you look back, especially at Go Nagai's work, when either like skim or read through his stuff that he made in the beginning, all the way up to like Devilman, and you can kind of see him grow as an author and as a storyteller as well, because Devilman is it's a hell of a work, y'all. It's also really heavy.
It throws dark real fucking hard.
Yeah, like even the Mazinger Z manga, from what I've read, doesn't even get that dark.
No, and even then, like the first chapter is like focusing a lot on Koji's inability to control Mazinger properly and levels half the fucking city.
Yeah,
like that's the other funny thing when you think about how popular Mazinger Z is. This is kind of like even more adjacent to all the other things I described that about like what could have led to it being popular, is that from Go Nagai's perspective, because this was what he was doing, like either as he was finishing Devilman or directly after, But Mazinger was basically his idea of trying to like blow off steam because of how much time and effort he was putting into making Devilman the way he wanted. And what do you know? The thing that he did as like just kind of a light change of pace would become one of the most influential robots to ever fucking exist.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how we got here. So with that prehistory out of the way, I think it's only fair to then go on about, we got to talk about the robots themselves. We got to talk about Mazinger Z itself, you know, because we've always established is that the mecha, the robots themselves are the characters. They are as much characters as the humans that are in control of them.
And I don't care what your anime podcasters say. This is the truth. This is our truth.
I reject your truth. This is our own. So Mazinger Z is the titular super robot, which, you know, as an interesting thing, if you look at its theme song, it even uses the word super robot in there. So there you go. There's already an answer to how the term super robot became, you know, part of the genre and used as a way to describe this particular class of mecha itself. But obviously in universe, like it being a super robot, that's because its body is composed of super alloy Z. You know, you got to have some kind of made up fictional alloy that allows it, you know, some manner of capabilities and strength that like other alloys or metals in the real world would not be capable of. So the result is that Mazinger is an extremely durable robot.
It is. It is as it says. It's indestructible, or practically indestructible.
So much so that it's like a good number of plots in Mazinger usually hinge around the fact that, like, as long as Koji is not anywhere in Mazinger, it can't do anything, and Koji is still defenseless.
Yep.
But I guess as far as describing more about Mazinger Z from, like, an aesthetic standpoint, because this is also important to cover when it comes to, like, how much it, like, influences everything that came after, even to the point where some of the stuff it influences, you would not even think that people really stick to a lot of its aesthetic designs nearly as much. But like but that might just be because of maybe a sense of respect towards Mazinger being the first of its type, that they don't want to crib too much from the way it looks, because it is very much a robot where, like, its torso, its arms, its legs are, like, you know, dark black, although the arms and legs are dark blue if you're watching the anime, because Toei decided to make a few visual modifications to it. But there's, you know, noticeable, like, instances of, like, red on it, like red chest fins that ties into one of its most powerful abilities, breast fire, and then the head, the face. Like, there's a lot that you could actually talk about, I think, regarding the design of just Mazinger's face itself because of how distinct it is.
Yeah, it almost looks like, would you call it almost like a knight helm with the way it looks?
I've always viewed it as like a fusion of like a knight's helmet and a king's crown.
Yeah, I can kind of see it.
Because the bottom half with like the mouth guard is very much like something you would see on like a fluted knight's helmet. Well, the shape of like the top of the head where the powder is seated, especially when the powder connects to it, gives off like the sense of being like a kind of like a medieval king's crown. Yeah, even in the 70s, when you think about how like simple these robot designs are compared to like the more detailed and aerodynamic designs that we see in robots today, that like there was no other robots to really pull that much influence from prior, unless I guess you could say Techijin 28, which also has a bit of a knight motif to it, because it also has a similar like fluted knight's mouth guard as part of the helmet. But that's kind of where it ends as far as Mazinger. There's actually a lot more influence pulled from Demon Lord Mao, I think it's called, which is like an earlier, like another early serious Go Nagai story, which the design of like the Demon Lord Mao, it was an influence on both Mazinger and Devilman as well, although you can see it a lot more clearly in Devilman naturally.
Yeah.
Mazinger, it's a lot more of that combined with the medieval knight king influences, which I think helps add to the idea of like Mazinger being this mythical, nigh indestructible giant of steel.
Yeah, and the other thing is like its design, when you look at it now, it might look simple, but this is a design that's stuck with people. Even to this day.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
like this is an iconic design.
Yeah, is like it's good enough that like you can even make more aerodynamic and sleeker designs that are based on it, and it will still be able to convey like the same motifs and ideas that it had all the way back in 72.
Yeah, that like you see that a lot with the later iterations of where they modernize the look a little. They still like retain a lot of the basics of the design, which really shows how strong it is.
And it's not just the durability that Mazinger has. It also has a fuckload of abilities in its arsenal. Like so many of which are iconic. Like number one with a bullet to anyone is the rocket punch.
The most iconic move in any Super Robot show ever. Like, it has become a requirement, a robot to have a rocket punch.
And there are even some shows out there where even if the technology and mechanisms in place are not able to make like a rocket punch work the way it does in Mazinger, they'll still find some way to workshop it.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe grab a severed fist and chuck it at a motherfucker. But Rocket Punch isn't all it has. You know, it's got breast fire. You know, the thing we mentioned that is emitted from the like the red chest fins. It's basically just a superheated beam of like red hot fire that can melt anything. We have Missile Punch, which is kind of a weird name in all honesty, because of like you would think that it being a punch means it's another rocket punch style ability, but no, it's just a missile that like comes out of like Mazinger's like midsection. It's kind of a weird one that is like with a good number of these abilities, you'll find that like the stuff that gets mentioned is a lot more exclusive to the anime, the original Toei anime, than you realize.
Yeah, and some of these moves are definitely less iconic than the others.
Yeah, Missile Punch kind of on the lower end. Rust Hurricane, however, is definitely on the iconic end, as it weaponizes, you know, like the holes in Mazinger's mouth guards to basically just blow out a stream of like acidic like dust particles that will just like ionize and rust anything that comes in contact with.
Yeah.
There's the photon beam, which they're just eye lasers, and depending on which entry in the Mazinger series that you watch, it'll either be just like a piddly little laser that is like on the lowest end of like the power scale, or is goddamn WMD tiers of destructive power. You know which one I'm talking about.
I do, and it is magnificent.
Others to finish it off are, you know, the Iron Cutter, which is an upgrade to the Rocket Punch, where it juts out like iron axe blades on the side, so you get punching and cutting power in the same attack. There's Drill Missile, which shoots out like tiny little needle drill missiles from Mazinger's elbow, basically after either a rocket punch is shot out, or it just flips up the forearm itself to reveal like where the drill missiles come from. And then kind of getting into, I guess before getting into like some of the final abilities it has, we have to talk about the Jet Scrander.
Yeah.
An important transformative piece of equipment that the Mazinger has, more than just the powder itself, which is the cockpit that docks with Mazinger's head. But the Jet Scrander is what allows it to fly. And it's kind of a big deal in all instances where it's introduced, because at the start, it is made very clear that Mazinger's one weakness is that it is only good for like ground battles.
Yeah.
It cannot deal with things in the air at all. So we give it a jetpack with wings. It looks awesome.
It just makes him look like he has a bunch of devil wings on his back. It rules.
Yeah, like the red colored wings in particular also is like what kind of brings it back to like the Demon Lord like the influences as well that we discussed before. But with the Jet Scrander, there are actually some additional abilities that are part of it, if you can believe it. There's the Scrander Cut, which comes from, you know, just charging straight first into a dude and like cutting through them with like the front edge of the wings, because of course they're bladed.
Of course they are.
And then there's Southern Cross Knife, which it just shoots out a bunch of like throwing stars out of the front of the blade. So it's like kind of a long range version. And sometimes, you know, in real improvisational moments, sometimes Mazinger can just use the Jet Scrander holding the wing with its hands and just swing it like a battle axe.
Or toss it like a boomerang. Don't ask how it comes back, it just does.
Yeah, like this is the most important thing that kind of like solidifies how great Mazinger is. it's not just the quantity of abilities it has, but it's also the creativity in which Mazinger will use these abilities in order to win the battle. I think it's easy, especially if you're familiar with like other like episodic hero type shows or other super robots that came after this that, you know, rely heavily on, you know, key animation for its signature attacks. You know, attacks that'll like play out pretty much the exact same way. And again, not just for robots. Hero shows do this as well. Yep. Pretty Cure does this, you know, if you want to go the magical girl route. But Mazinger doesn't really abide by that. It's like he'll use like Koji will have Mazinger use a rocket punch or iron cutter in like 5 different ways.
Yeah, you're
like that's the genius of it. Mazinger is so great that it's like, yeah, there are other robots as well, but like they don't matter. Actually, no, that's not true. It's just they're kind of like more in like a more reduced role because we know who the star is. There are at least some supporting robots that deserve some mention, like Aphrodite A, for instance, which is a female super robot. It's similarly composed to Super Alloy Z, but it's just not designed to the same level of specification like Mazinger is because it wasn't designed by Juzo Kabuto. It was actually designed by the head of the Photon Power Labs. So it's got less abilities than Mazinger, but it does have boob missiles. Thanks, Go Nagai.
Thanks, Go Nagai. Thanks for creating boob missiles. By the way, when you look at the design of this thing, it is the opposite of Mazinger Z, where Mazinger Z is cool, Aphrodite is kind of not. It's just...
Yeah, like, you know, it's got, like, the color scheme as well kind of reflects it, you know, like yellow and, like, kind of pink fuchsia. It does have the same cockpit kind of, like, placement of it being in the head, except there's no powder system for it. So you get, like, this big glass spherical dome over the top of the head. But it's the sort of thing where I think kind of if we go back to like visual influences and motifs, if Mazinger Z is like taking like a bit more demonic influences in kind of its design and color scheme, I think Aphrodite is meant to be a lot more representative of like kind of more angelic designs. At least that's the attempt.
That's the attempt, but yeah.
There's definitely other female robots that come after this that I think do a lot better job of it, like Diane or Venus A.
Yeah.
And then there's Boss Borot. We love Boss Borot, even though no one takes Borot seriously. It's a rotund little robot that's built from scrap metal and basically exists for comic relief.
Yeah, this is a Boss Borot appreciation zone. It is just a giant chunk of metal, but it doesn't care. It has spirit.
Yes, it fights with brute strength, impromptu weapons as the plot demands, and sheer guts. Yeah, it's also, because of the comic relief kind of angle that Boss Borot takes, it's actually like the one robot in the entire series where it actively emotes and like abides even less by realistic rules of how metal and inorganic objects should be able to behave. Because it's like, it's kind of similar color scheme wise to Aphrodite A. You know, there's a lot of yellows, a lot of pink, orange kind of as part of its mix. But you look at the head, it's like this pink ball with like very human eyes that are actually able to blink and emote, you know, in order to show, you know, goofy reactions to when things go horribly wrong during the episode.
I was going to say it definitely works on cartoon logic a lot of the time.
But and as far as other robots, you know, these are like pretty much the main defining ones that are on the side of the Photon Power Labs. You know, this is on the side of the good guys. But what about the bad guys? Well, we've got the mechanical beasts from the island of Bardos. They are the main robot attack force of Dr. Hell, mechanical giants left behind by the Mykonai Empire deep inside the island. And there's a lot of them. Obviously, a lot more of them that exist in the anime compared to the manga with what Go Nagai was able to create. But there's at least some notable units, to name a few. I think most famously, for anyone that has watched enough Mazinger media overall, they are very intimately familiar with Double M2 and Garda K7.
Yeah, these two have pretty much pop up in almost any like Mazinger related media as grunt enemies.
They are always first on the chopping block for Mazinger to beat the shit out of.
Yeah, and they also have like some striking designs to them as well.
Yeah, Doubless is like defined by essentially being like a two-headed kind of dragon looking thing. Although again, dragon is a bit of a loose description because like these are very 70s robot designs that get very weird. But Garda is like, its designing features that it's got a skull face with 2 horns that are actually sickle blades that it can detach and then use as weapons.
Yeah.
I think just for that reason alone, if we have to pick which of the 2 starting Kikaiju are like my favorite, I definitely prefer Garda K7.
I think Garda's pretty much a winner here.
There's others that come after that are interesting, like Dom Dom L2, which is like just basically take a pillar on its side, put 2 spiked wheels on the end, and then a face in the middle, and it's just like basically just a giant fucking wheel that charges at you. Or Tauros D7, which is essentially like one of the few quadruped Kikaiju out there. With like a horn on it. It's like another thing that's just kind of ramming you. There's a lot of Kikaiju. We could be here all day if we just brought up an entire list of every single mechanical beast and had to like name off every single one that seems notable. But like these are at least the ones that are most likely to show up, depending on like no matter which piece of media in Mazinger you decide to check out.
Yeah, you are definitely going to see a lot of Kikaiju, especially in the anime, because it is, like I mentioned before, it's a monster of the week, and sometimes they end up just recycling the same monsters because there's a lot of episodes, but we'll get there. We'll get there. We got through the robots, so naturally we got to get through the human characters, you know, like the people that are in charge of all these robots and you know, use them to save the day or destroy it, depending on which side you're on. So, like, at the Photon Power Labs, basically, like, the good guys, we obviously have mentioned his name before. We got to talk about the OG super robot pilot, Koji Kabuto, the protagonist. Hot-blooded and reckless, but with a strong sense of justice. He's pretty much like the prototypical hot-blooded protagonist you see in a lot of super robot shows, at least during this era, and maybe some in the 90s.
Interesting thing as well to describe is, like, because not just for super robots, but also this is very much a Go Nagai protagonist.
Oh, yeah.
One that I think has, you know, like a lot more of like the less savory elements kind of like whittle away compared to, say, you know, Akira Fudo in Devilman, who is very much, you know, demonically possessed.
Yeah.
Or Violence Jack. But like in the case of Kabuto, one thing that is important to mention design-wise as well is like, you know, black spiky hair, you know, very, very cool appearance, you know, the appealing kind of 70s anime protagonist. But an important thing that you see in a lot of Go Nagai characters are sideburns. And I have handily, like, set aside, like, a categorization system as far as, like, what each type of sideburn is factored into. Mm-hmm. Like, you have type A, which is typically, like, the very bushy, flowing kind of sideburns. The one that you see on like Akira Fudo from Devilman, for instance. I'd say he's like the best example. Mm-hmm. Koji, meanwhile, has type B sideburns, in which they are not bushy and flowing. Instead, they are very straight. And then, like, after they get to, like, right where, like, the bottom of the ear is, they jut out forward, kind of facing the same direction that the character is, and, like, converge into a single point.
Yeah.
Ryo Asuka from Devilman also has those type B sideburns, by the way, but I'd say they're more easily identifiable as being like they're like a defining aspect of Koji's design.
It wouldn't be Koji without the pointy sideburns.
Yeah, like no matter how much you change or update like the character designs to like kind of reflect the decade you're in, fuck you if you ever get rid of the sideburns. They stay.
Yeah, you got the other characters.
Yep, we got Sayaka Yumi, who is the pilot of Aphrodite A. She's the heroine, can be quite stubborn, and frequently gets into fights with Koji, but she obviously has feelings for him. You can very much see how, like, she is quite possibly, like, the earliest example of a tsundere type in anime.
Yeah.
There you go.
Kinda.
Although the fights that they get into, especially when you look at them in the anime, can get real fucking vicious.
Yeah, the anime is of a time, y'all.
Yes, that's one thing I actually forgot to mention regarding Koji's character. That is mostly because it's fortunately whittled away this aspect as the decades have gone on, but there is very much an acceptance of 70s misogyny in Koji's character.
Yeah, I would say a lot of it is kind of hilarious at how misogynist it is, like, holy shit.
But which is why it's so offset by just a lot of fights between the two of them that come off a lot like domestic disputes.
Yeah.
It's hilarious in a way where like you start laughing in the moment, but like the more it goes on, like that laughter quickly starts to fade when you become like significantly more uncomfortable by it.
Yeah, it just turns it goes from ha 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 to ha, just like an uncomfortable laugh.
Mom, Dad, please stop.
Please stop. This is getting really I really would like this to stop now, please.
So let's get to someone that doesn't have those issues.
Yes, like-
Boss. He is Boss Borot's pilot, originally a bully that later joins Koji's cause in fighting Dr. Hell. He's got two cronies named Nuke and Mucha who also pilot Boss Borot with him. He's the best. Not even the author knows his real name.
He's just boss in our hearts. They're their comedy trio, pretty much.
Go Nagai could be on his deathbed and, like, as his final gift to the world, reveal what Boss's actual name is, and I would be like, bullshit, I don't believe you.
No, he's boss to me. I don't care what you say. Shut up.
He's been boss for 50 years. He's going to stay boss for another 50. He's great. He's a fucking goofy ass character, obviously, and again, but that's also like the fun part of his character, where like he's big, chunky. He's also got a little bit of sideburns himself, kind of a bit more of the type A kind, but obviously not as pronounced as actual Go Nagai protagonists tend to be. But I do like, again, the part that makes Boss so endearing is that, again, as part of his backstory, is that he is a bully. He's a big guy that like picks on like the people that he sees as weaker than him, and it's only because Koji is that much tougher of a dude than he is that I guess obviously this is like decades before we had the glorious Robert E.O. Speedwagon devote himself to the Joestars, but it very much kind of feels that way.
It's very, very Speedwagon in a way.
Like, yeah, enemies to friends in like one of the purest ways possible. And then remaining characters, you have Professor Yumi, who is Sayaka's father, as you might imagine, head of the Photon Power Labs, was actually a colleague of Juzo Kabuto, kind of researching photonic power. But obviously, like, the two of those split. Oh yeah, and by the way, if it's not any surprise as to why we don't have like a section talking about Juzo Kabuto, yeah, it's because he fucking dies at the start. He literally like dies and gives Mazinger Z as like his parting legacy to Koji. That's the whole extent of his character. That, and he's kind of insane.
Also, I just want to point out the moment he pops up in the manga is kind of funny because he's so different from everybody else. He looks like he popped up from a different series. Like, just look at him.
Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah, that's a face you do not want to wake up to in the morning.
No.
So much so that it could scare someone. Like Koji's little brother, Shiro Kabuto. He's around. He's another source of comic relief, aside from Boss himself. Usually the kind of comedy relief that's almost there to, like, give commentary on, like, kind of the absurdity of what's happening. But like, he does, I mean, like, even though he comes off as a bit of, like, the tag-along, there are some episodes, there are some story arcs in, like, various entries in the series where he does get a bit more to kind of flesh him out. But it's, like, it is the sort of thing where, like him and Koji are like good brothers. Like they are close knit, because they like their parents they lost them at a young age. Like Juzo had basically been raising them when they were at a very young age. So naturally that bond's gonna be pretty tight. And if anything happens to Shiro, God help you, because Koji is going to make sure that you wish he killed you.
Oh boy, will he?
Yeah, you do not do anything to the Kabuto family. Those are our heroes, though, so we got to talk about, obviously, the antagonists, such as Dr. Hell, the antagonist, the primary one. Yes, that is his given family name. He was born that evil.
Listen, y'all, this is a super robot show from the 70s. We're not exactly subtle here. We want you to know that he's a bad guy.
This is fucking Japan. We literally have an episode of, like, the first Super Sentai series ever where they have Starfish Hitler.
Yeah.
Like Japan knows writers that use subtext, and they believe that they're all cowards.
Yeah, there is no subtext here. There's no subtlety. We're here to punch bad guys.
Although if you look a bit more closely at Dr. Hell's design and backstory, is that visually he only became more evil looking when he decided to become the villain that wanted to conquer the entire world. Like, yes, Dr. Hell is his given family name, but he didn't always have pale blue skin and like white, and like the whites of his eyes being all yellow. Like, he didn't look explicitly like a demon, but he eventually decided to just adopt that look when he decided that he discovered the mechanical beast hidden inside Bardo's Island, and we're like, holy shit, World conquest would be so easy with this.
I mean, with a name like Doctor... If your name was Dr. Hell, wouldn't you do the same?
I would probably try and ensure beforehand that, like, there wasn't an invincible giant robot that could stand up to everything I threw at it. Yeah. Like, if I saw that, I would be like, well, I'll just like take solace in the fact that I got my own private island. Yeah. But at least Dr. Hell is not alone in this foolhardy quest for conquering the world, because he has some allies, and they are some fucking weirdos.
Boy, are they.
For instance, Baron Ashra, loyal minion, half man, half woman, split down the middle. Yes, it is as terrifying as it sounds. It is not. There's always been like the hermaphrodite term, obviously, to kind of describe, when you have like a character that has the genitalia of like both genders. But this is not that. This is not that kind of person. They were not born this way. They were literally made this way when Dr. Hell excavated their bodies from the depths of Bardos Island and found that like only like half of each of their bodies was in any good condition. So he just fused them together.
As you do. Also, like, the other thing about them is that whenever they speak, it's with you get like a man and a woman voice speaking at the same time.
Yes. The exception, very creatively, I will add, is if you get like a side profile shot of them talking, in which you will only hear the voice that is associated with that side. Like the right side is like the female side of Baron Ashra, while the left side is like the male. And so, yeah, if in other situations where if you're able to clearly see both halves of Baron Ashra, you will hear both of their voices, like, speaking in unison. It's very impressive. Like, it is, like, props to every, like, voice acting duo throughout this franchise's entire history that are able to, like, get in the mindset of this freak show.
I can't imagine being easy. But that's voice acting for you.
And they're usually the first of Dr. Hell's minions that are in charge of like the various attacks against Mazinger before they eventually fail one too many times and get replaced by another loyal minion, such as Count Brocken, who wears a World War II style military uniform and carries his severed head in his arms. He's got his head in one arm and a riding crop in the other, because boy, again, like, yeah, we were talking about lack of subtlety. See if this reminds you of like of a certain dictatorship from the 40s.
Man, I wonder what he's supposed to be, what he's supposed to represent.
I'll give you a hint. His introduction in the manga literally has him like invading a neighborhood in Japan and being like, all right, we're going to forcefully conscript all of these men to fight. Anyone that is a woman, a child, or sick and elderly, just kill him. Yeah, no shit, Dr. Hell would have like a fucking Dullahan Nazi as one of its loyal minions.
Oh, as I said, this is not a subtle show about what it's trying to do.
It is not.
It's like, yo, these are the bad guys, y'all, by the way.
There is one other bad guy as well to cover, but it is not as much of a loyal minion as you would think, and that is Archduke Gorgon, a supposed ally that gets introduced like quite a ways into the anime as someone to kind of help Dr. Hell as he is clearly getting his ass kicked time and time again. The design is similarly bizarre. It is a human torso with like, Roman warrior garb that is attached to the hind back of a tiger. Like torso attached to the body of an animal. You would think, oh, like a centaur, so it's in the front. No, it's in the back. You still get the tiger face on the front. Like, it's still the full body of a tiger itself. So it's like this weird sort of thing where, like, it's a torso that's riding on top of it as if it were a steed. And the other important thing to note about Gorgon itself is that this goes into how he's a supposed ally to Dr. Hell. That is because he becomes much more important in the sequel series, Great Mazinger, where... surprise, he's just waiting for Dr. Hell to fuck up and lose completely so that his faction could come in and clean house.
Yeah, Great Mazinger has like a different set of bad guys, which we probably won't be getting into right now, but...
Nah. Only in a cursory capacity, but, we've covered all the major stuff. We got like, the basic plot. We've described our robots, our characters, the prehistory... So that's all said and done. Mm-hmm. What exactly is the extent of Mazinger's impact and legacy?
Oh.
I mean, we've alluded this much.
Yeah.
It is fucking huge. The Mazinger Z anime aired from December 3rd, 1972, all the way to September 1st, 1974. This was an anime that ran for 92 episodes. Compared to every, like, long-form mecha anime that has, like, come out in the decades following, this is, like, an anomaly. This is, like, most don't bother going for, like, more than 52 episodes.
Yeah, this is a behemoth of a show. This incredible. It even went as long as it did.
Like, so much so that I'm pretty sure, like, the reason for it being 92 episodes is because the popularity just kept growing throughout 73, that it became clear that, like, we need to keep this train going. Yeah. And it also kind of coincided with the fact that it took about that exact same amount of time for Go Nagai to get through the original manga, which ran from, like, I believe it was October of 72, and then ended in 74, like, in September as well. So basically, yeah, for about the same length of time as the anime did.
Yeah.
And, yeah, the popularity from those 92 episodes, that entire runtime, contributed to so many things. You know, obviously we mentioned it was the creation of the super robot genre, which at the time might as well have only been the only giant robot genre, because there would be a lot more that comes into play in the future. Mentioned as much that, like, the word super robot came from the lyrics of its theme song. You know, Sora ni sobearu kurogane no shiro super roboto Mazinger Z.
Yeah.
Yep. Which, by the way, sung by the legendary Ichiro Mizuki, who would go on to sing the main themes for so many other Super Robot anime. His output and association with such classics is what landed him the title of the King of Anison. Anison being the Japanese kind of portmanteau of anime song.
And if some of y'all know of a little band called Jam Project, he was one of the people who helped found that.
Oh, yeah. There's so many things that we'll talk about across all these different episodes, like Super Robot and Real Robot genre terms is one of them. Jam Project is also going to be another thing, because, like, so many of those people will show up in these works more than you realize.
Yeah, you have no idea how many mecha songs these people have sung. But you'll know. We'll let you know.
Very much so. Yeah. One thing I do want to cover as well before we get into the other stuff that came out, like, after the TV anime ended, is that Mazinger Z did actually have a few movies that came out during its airtime. They were, like, known as, like, versus movies. Stuff that was, like, part team up, part, you know, actual versus, you know, like the original idea of, like, the first movie that kind of spawned this was Mazinger Z versus Devilman. With the idea of just, you know, combining two of Go Nagai's most popular manga anime properties and, like, putting them in a situation where kind of the basis as well for what Toei would use for the Super Sentai team-up movies, where it's always kind of first framed as, like, as an initial conflict between the two crossovers before realizing, wait, no, there's someone way worse than either of us. We should team up to defeat them. But more than that, like, one of those versus movies that is quite significant in leading to some of Mazinger's sequels is a little movie called Mazinger Z versus the Great General of Darkness, which portrays a plot in which Dr. Hell is finally defeated once and for all. The heroes are celebrating, they're having a beach party. However, there are ominous signs that something even worse than Dr. Hell is coming this way. And it turns out, it's Archduke Gorgon's boys, the Mike and I Empire. They're back. They're here to fuck shit up. And Mazinger has to stop them, even though the first fight goes pretty poorly. His brother, Gishiro, takes a bit of falling debris to the head and falls into a coma, needs a blood transfusion. Things are looking dire. He has to go into the fight knowing full well that there is a good chance he might die, which is terrifying to him. And as dire as the whole situation is, a hero arrives. Mazinger Z's big brother, a robot that surpasses it, called Great Mazinger. And the thing that stood out to me, like, this is one of those things where I think because of just how huge the original anime is in terms of quantity of episodes, and that it might be a bit difficult to, you know, get into, especially for people that have the habit of binging anime these days, if there's one piece of classic Mazinger content that I think is worth watching, please do watch Versus the Great General of Darkness.
Yeah.
It's a very solid movie, and it brings up something that has been in my head for also a couple of years now, where I've had to wonder, did this movie make Japanese kids in the 70s cry because they saw Mazinger getting the absolute shit kicked out of it in a way that no episode in the anime ever did? And that the only thing to bail it out was a new, better version of Mazinger to replace it? Like, I think about how, like, the Transformers movie from the 80s, like, I always heard, like, anecdotes and stories from people back then about how, like, kids were so visibly upset seeing Optimus Prime die, and then being, like, contrasted with, like, the obvious cynicism of, oh, Hasbro did it because they just wanted an excuse to push out, like, the next line of Transformers toys. Like, Mazinger, Super Robots as a whole, at this early of a junction, were not, like, as, like, closely tied to merchandising the same way they would be by the time you got to the end of the decade. So I have to wonder, like, how much of this was just another instance of Go Nagai pushing subjects and taboos way harder than, like, anyone else was willing to. Like, the idea of killing your hero to replace it, to have it be reborn with a new and better hero. I genuinely wonder, and that's so hard to get any clear answers because that was from so long ago.
Yeah, like, I don't know if it's true, but I want to believe that a little child was traumatized by seeing Mazinger just getting torn apart.
There is at least one manga from the past 10 years that actually kind of ties into some of the concepts of Versus the Great General of Darkness, and it's actually because of that and how characters in the manga itself react to seeing it that makes me want to believe that that was the case.
Oh, yeah. Also, like, to go back a little to what you said about if you're going to watch something, watch The Great General of Darkness. The other thing about the show itself is, for all this, we're going to talk, y'all, we're going to talk a lot about shows we love and that we're going to recommend you watching us. I don't know if I could recommend the original Mazinger Z TV show.
At most, we could only ever recommend specific episodes just to get a taste for, like, what the ground floor for this genre was like. But, like, that's the important thing with all these overview episodes, just to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering on these major franchises, is that the first entry is very rarely going to be something we recommend you watch in full. I think only one, maybe two, where is something where that's actually applicable, but that's not really the case with Mazinger. Like, you don't need to watch large portions of it. You just need to, like, watch something like the team up versus movies and, like, a few highlight episodes to really get a sense for, like, what the show was about and how, like, it was popular with, like, the sensibilities of, like, audiences in the 70s.
Yeah, the other thing about the anime, the original Mazinger anime, is that it kind of sanded off some of the edges from the manga as well to make it more kid-friendly, I guess.
Yeah, I would say, like, not nearly as much as, like, that treatment was given to some of the other, like, Dynamic Pro manga that got anime adaptations. I mean, we'll have episodes where we talk about Get a Robo. There's a lot to cover about how tonally different that shit is.
Yeah.
But I would say, at least in the case of Mazinger, I think a lot more of its influence is rightfully owed to the anime itself because there's just a higher volume of creative things in there, like, way more than, like, what Go Nagai was able to put into print.
Yeah.
But as far as, like, other things, you know, because, we mentioned that Go Nagai would make more super robots besides just Mazinger Z. We've mentioned Versus the Great General of Darkness being the introduction of Great Mazinger. It's funny how that movie came about, where that was actually... It aired a few months before the TV show actually ended. And the final episode more or less covers the same setup, just with some differences. I imagine differences just to make the severity of Mazinger losing not feel so traumatizing.
Oh, definitely.
Because, yes, Great Mazinger was the next TV anime and manga that succeeded it. And then following that, Great Mazinger was 1974, ran for about 50-ish episodes, significantly shorter, but also, like, a lot more dramatic. But then also following that, in 1975, was UFO Robo Grandizer. Still part of the same series, though in a lot of ways kind of different in its own right, and also very popular in certain territories, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, these shows might not be popular in the West, but they are insanely popular in like those certain parts of Europe and the Middle East.
Yeah, they gravitated to like some of these anime exports like a lot sooner than like the United States did. Absolutely. And these two aren't the only ones that came out of Dynamic Pro. You know, obviously, like another famous example, we mentioned the name Get a Robo, which was by Go Nagai's good friend Ken Ishikawa. That was like his brainchild. Had a manga, had an anime series, as well as a sequel anime that ran during the 70s. Other Dynamic Pro series that came after this was like Steel Geek, Dai King. Although when you get to stuff like Dai King and even less known Groiser X, is that you start to get more like giant robots that were clearly first originated from Dynamic Pro and Go Nagai's entire company, but they were clearly made more with like the audiences of like Toei's anime viewers in mind rather than Go Nagai's specific audience, if you get my meaning. Yeah. So much so that like the creation of Dai King was kind of fraught with like legal troubles afterwards because Go Nagai was the original creator, but Toei was like basically trying to scrub Dynamic Pro's entire involvement and association with it, which led to a falling out between the two parties. But even outside of those specific like robot series that came about from Go Nagai and his company, there were still plenty of other studios that would like tap into this now like humongous giant robot craze in anime. Everyone wanted to get in on having their own super robots. And one studio that I would say put out the other crop of notable robots from this decade was Sunrise, which they're obviously more well known these days for, you know, a completely different type of robot show, a completely different genre for that matter. But, you know, they made all kinds of stuff that had its own impact in a different way compared to Go Nagai. I mean, like, because their first one was Brave Raideen in 75, had the distinction actually of being the first fully transforming robot. You know, not necessarily like transforming into like a real vehicle or anything, but it was a robot that had a transformation gimmick to it. And on top of that, it wasn't even a robot that was a product of like sci-fi, you know, like a product of science or anything like that. It was instead more like a mythological being. So like that was definitely a way to like make it stand out more, even as early as 1975. Yeah, and just so many others. You know, like Combattler V is another big one where it's like that was like a, you know, like we briefly mentioned Get a Robo, but like not so much the part where it was like the first instance of a combining robot, but like the way that it approached being a combiner is different from how Combattler V would, I think, make a more popular version where it was 5 vehicles combining into one distinct set-in-stone robot form. And if that sounds familiar with it being 5 vehicles, that is because, yes, it did precede the Super Sentai series having that exact same style of combining robot that has been a series tradition since Battle Fever J, I believe it was. Or, yeah, that's right, Battle Fever, because, the early naming scheme for Super Sentai during the 70s was still weird as fuck. Like, they hadn't figured things out yet, but they did figure out the robots by that point.
When you look at this era of super robot shows, there's a lot of them, and they definitely start to blend together a little too much. But some shows like Combattler V and even like Raideen managed to stand out.
Yeah, and then and that's not even getting to some of the others. So we can mention off the top of our head how there's, you know, like Zambot 3 or Daitarn 3. A good number of these, funny enough, are actually directed by Yoshiyuki Tamino.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about Zambot 3. Whatever.
Oh, we'll have a lot to talk about with Zambot 3. Oh, man. But alas, like this kind of mainstream boom that super robots had during the 70s would eventually have to fade away after a point because, you know, 79, I think even people that aren't really as initiated in mecha as we are already understand that Gundam was eventually introduced in 1979. And we'll definitely talk about how its trajectory and popularity was very different from Mazinger. But eventually, by the time the 80s rolled around, that clearly gained like the popular favor in Japan over the super robots of old, to the point where like it definitely faded more into obscurity compared to its real robot brethren. But even then, it's not like it would go away completely or just become this antiquated thing that people look at and go, oh, that's no longer cool, because the 90s onward would see it getting super robots would definitely see more of a mainstream resurgence in multiple ways, I would add. You know, some that are very light and classic, others that are very dark and more mature, serious type of stories. And even some that just blur the lines between what is real robot and what is super robot. So regardless of like its changing popularity over the decades compared to real robots or really like other genres in anime, because you could definitely look at what anime is especially mainstream around the world these days, they are genres that do not involve giant robots.
Yeah.
But no matter what, Mazinger Z's impact has been strong enough that it can be argued that the entire history of anime, hell, pop culture as we know it in general, would be irrevocably different had it not existed. The very idea of giant robots in our modern popular consciousness owes itself to Mazinger, even if it is not explicitly a super robot.
Yeah, that is not an exaggeration, because the influence this has had on pop culture in Japan it's just so hard to think about. But we wouldn't have shows like Gundam without this. We wouldn't have some of the most popular like mecha anime today.
And again, like it's the sort of thing where even if Mazinger is not at the forefront of people's mind, like it's more than enough that like if that when you have a new Gundam series or another mecha anime that like makes a big splash, you know, even if it doesn't bear the same themes or concepts or ideas as Mazinger, just the fact that it exists continues to like venerate Mazinger by proxy.
Yeah, it's like how Dragon Ball Z became the blueprint for shonen itself. Mazinger Z is like the blueprint for mecha going forward.
Yeah, I guess as far as modern blueprints, technically, even though it's a genre that has like a very weird kind of history when you think about it, but like the modern magical girl definitely owes itself to Sailor Moon.
Yeah.
Even though you look at magical girls the decades prior, and it is a very different type of thing. And to kind of further cement the importance of Mazinger Z's impact on the genre of mecha, everyone's favorite long-running strategy RPG series, Super Robot Wars, is practically defined by Mazinger itself being like one of the ultimate mainstays of that entire franchise. Like the thing to note about how Super Robot Wars started is that it basically had three franchises at like its core. It was Mazinger, it was Getter Robo, and it was Mobile Suit Gundam. You know, like original Universal Century, the OG Gundam. And it's the sort of thing where like kind of as that franchise has gone on, I'm pretty sure this is the case, there has not been a Super Robot Wars game that has omitted Mazinger in any form.
No.
Like even if it's not Mazinger Z explicitly, there's at least some other interpretation of Mazinger that still gets in there.
Also, for people who don't know, Super Robot Wars is a strategy, like a turn-based strategy game that's a giant crossover between a lot of other like mecha series. And Mazinger has pretty much been in every single game. Not even like UC Gundam has been in every game. Not even technically, you got some games have Shin Getter instead of Getter Robo.
Again, that's more just like general overall franchise view, because again, like there are some where it is like you get, you know, like a Majin Kaiser or Grandizer or something like that. Like it's definitely like as long as it's something that it has an association with Mazinger, it has been in Super Robot Wars.
Yeah.
And like it's always important that like we're always going to bring up Super Robot Wars in some capacity because it is such a good barometer for like getting a sense of how many different giant robot anime like series there are out there, and how that might be a good source of like inspiration as far as like which one you might want to check out.
Yeah.
But obviously this podcast helps to give you, the listeners at home, like a bit more detail as to, okay, these pretty much everything we're talking about for this podcast has been featured in Super Robot Wars in some capacity. It's just up to us. It's our mission to basically describe in more detail why it's that good. So I guess the last thing we need to do to wrap things up, we gotta lightning round this shit. We gotta go over the subsequent entries a bit more about like what they are, and you know, just kind of a brief, you know, should you or should you not check it out in some capacity. Obviously, we said as much about the original Mazinger Z anime. It's like at the very least, check out Versus the Great General of Darkness and maybe like a few episodes. I think my personal one would be to check out the episode of the anime that introduces the one-time character of Minerva X, because just knowing that character exists and what its origin is about actually plays into a manga later on, by the way. Which we'll cover that a bit more. Yeah. But otherwise, do not look at Mazinger Z as a franchise, as like an anime that you need to mainline the same way you would any modern season of anime. No. It's not built for that. Definitely read the manga, though, because at least it's shorter, and, like, I can at least count on people to be faster readers, like, faster at reading than it takes for, like, most anime to, like, make good use of their time slots. But what about everything that comes after? Obviously, there's Great Mazinger, which is the sequel, follows a new version of Mazinger piloted by Tetsuya Tsurugi, who is trained by Koji Kabuto's father, whose, spoiler, was actually not dead this whole time. He was off, like, building this other Mazinger in secret because they had to prepare for an even greater threat than Dr. Hell, which was the return of the Maikanai Empire. It's a much darker and more dramatic story because to kind of highlight how the kind of people that get attracted to creating works of fiction in this genre is that even like immediately after finishing Mazinger Z and kind of establishing the tropes and narrative concepts that like define it, Great Mazinger was willing to like kind of twist some of those concepts as early as 74. Like Tetsuya is another hot-blooded protagonist, but like his hot-bloodedness actually factors into some real character flaws, like deliberate flaws in his personality that lead to, events taking place in the story that give it a lot more of a dramatic flair.
Yeah, he's
got daddy issues, let's just say.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
It's a shame your daddy issues had to get your not daddy killed. Good job, asshole.
Thanks.
That said, though, it's another case of, it has the manga that I think is even more important to read than the anime, just because like the really big important character moments for Tetsuya are represented in full in the manga. Like his relation with like Kenzo Kabuto, his girlfriend June. I don't think the manga goes into quite as much detail as the anime did regarding her mixed race origins and the fact that she actually faced racism growing up. But that is definitely a thing with June Hono, like the fact that like she like is half Japanese. But half black, so like she has darker skin, and that led to like kind of being ostracized by people growing up, and Tetsuya like basically saw her for who she really was.
I actually had no idea.
Yes, even in the 70s, anime had the bravery to go, fuck racism.
I mean, it's concerning it was the 70s. That's still pretty impressive. They made an episode like that. I don't know how much it would hold up today.
Certainly could have put a bit more effort into stemming some of the 70s misogyny, but whatever. You win some, you lose some.
Listen, it was just the times. We can't do much about that.
Yeah, you just gotta accept that that's kind of how it was made back then, and just go in with an open and critical mind.
Oh yeah.
But the following series after this was UFO Grandizer, which follows. It doesn't follow anything directly related to the Kabutos or like the Mazingers themselves. It follows an alien robot called Grandizer, piloted by the Prince of Planet Fleet, known as Duke Fleet. He flees to Earth when his kingdom is subjugated by the Vega Empire and assumes the role of Daisuke Uman to hide out on Earth. Like becomes basically adopted by a scientist who is like pretty much in all canon, literally a confirmed bachelor. So it's already suspicious even to everyone around him. That's like, what? He suddenly has a son? But then the Vega Empire arrives on Earth and he has to board Grandizer to fight off the invaders. And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier as far as how other parts of the world before like the West, basically like before most places west of the Iron Curtain got into anime, was just the idea that Grandizer got a huge boost in popularity in countries like Italy, Saudi Arabia, and France, because it was kind of one of those early anime exports for them in the late 70s. And like for Saudi Arabia in particular, especially with kind of where they were in that part of history, was like kind of like a big boost for like kind of like the people's like kind of like the people's like mood and like kind of hopes at the time.
Yeah.
Like basically like an anime series of a giant robot that could basically be like their own personal hero.
we cannot emphasize how big this is in like Saudi Arabia and just the Middle East in general. It is one of the defining, if you ask some people what one of their like defining childhood cartoons are, they'll probably mention Grendizer.
Although they probably would not mention it as Grendizer itself because of, the fact that it went by a different name. It was Goldorak in Saudi Arabia, which I'm going to say, as far as localized names you could come up with, that's actually one of the better ones. That sounds like a name that someone in Japan could have come up with for a giant robot.
Oh, we never mentioned what the American name for Mazinger was when they tried to localize it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we completely skipped over Transor Z because, like, most people honestly should ignore that Transor Z ever existed.
Oh, that is not a good name.
No, it is not. It's like with what we know and how we use language today, like you would somehow think that this is like a very, very tone deaf like transsexual story, or like. I think someone more positively could try to take it to be like a robot version of of the trans experience.
Probably.
Someone could probably these days use it more tastefully, but yeah, like obviously the localization, it had nothing to do with that, obviously, but just the name Transor Z is so oof.
Yeah, maybe it's for the best it didn't take off in the West.
No, it did not. It's weird though, considering how it basically got like. I think most of the episodes, like especially the major ones, including the finale, did get localized anyway, which meant that it did end on the sort of cliffhanger that was supposed to lead into Great Mazinger. But I guess it's also for the best we did not get a Great Transor.
Yeah.
But yeah, Grendizer, Great Mazinger, original Mazinger Z, they are all in the same camp of read the manga, check out a few episodes of the anime if you're so inclined. Just because that's kind of how it is, although audiences that were in the countries where Grendizer was exported to, it became a huge hit, and it's like, no kidding. Like, watch it how you like. It's your show. It's as much your show as it is Japan's.
Yeah.
You deserve it. So this is the first of hopefully not too many addendums, but one thing that neither I nor Neff thought to mention about the original Mazinger Z anime was the infamous crabstick subs. The name came from a line in a translation derived from Hong Kong bootlegs, in which Dr. Hell proclaims, "Only with this crabstick can I control the might of the mechanical beast army." But that only scratches the surface of the sub's insanity when there are such magnificent quotes as, "Increase the soup. Don't be a cockhorse. Shit the bullshit again. Hello, I am Helmet." And most famously, "We are entering the age of fatso." So, even if you don't watch a full episode of the 70s Mazinger Z anime, at least look up some screen caps with the crabstick subs and have yourself a big ol' laugh. And now back to the show. So following that though, as far as our subsequent entries we're going to cover, there's not much we're really going to... There were actually some Mazinger related things from the 80s and early 90s, but we're not really going to cover that because there wasn't any major anime that like came about until the 21st century. Like there was technically God Mazinger, but that was less so of a giant robot story, more of an 80s isekai where like the God Mazinger in question was like a stone golem. The Gonagai did try also at one point to like make a Mazinger Z comic that would have gotten picked up in the West, like to try to help it gain more popularity overseas, but that kind of fell through. There was Majin Saga, which was might sound familiar for any Sega Genesis fans out there, because there was a beat 'em up that was actually based on it that got localized in the West somehow.
Oh, I did not know that actually.
Yeah, it's not quite good to play. I mean, it's no Streets of Rage, but then again, what is? But it is the sort of thing where it does try to like capture like the kind of Monster of the Week vibe, where it is like you're kind of like on the ground floor just fighting goons like a normal beat 'em up, but then when you get to the end of a stage, you fight against the giant monster in like your Mazinger, and it's basically more like a one-on-one fighting game. It's an interesting concept. Yeah. Obviously not super polished, but still surprised that they somehow managed to put that out in English in 1993. But never mind that. Now we got to get to the entries where our recommendations for them are glowing.
Yeah, now these ones are the ones that we would actually recommend you to watch.
So much so that we're not going to get into too much detail here, because we actually have a number of episodes that are dedicated to them. For instance, Majin Kaiser, the OVA from 2001, based on an idea that actually originated in Super Robot Wars. We could get into more detail about it then, but basically the Mazinger Z that was created for Super Robot Wars was like not the same one that was made for the OVA itself, but the inspiration was there because Banpresto basically wanted Go Nagai to kind of create him to create a betterer version of Mazinger that could stand up to where Getter Robo was at this point, where it had already gone to the level of like, there's now Shin Getter Robo, which is like the ultimate, the apex version of Getter Robo itself. And they were like, what's the apex version of Mazinger? And so the OVA, like, yeah, while using different origin point, it's essentially a secret Mazinger prototype that not even Koji was made aware of even before Juzo fucking gave up the ghost. Because it's like, if Mazinger was about being a robot that could make its user become a god or a demon, Mazinger Z allows its user to kill gods and demons.
Pretty much. Also, Mazinger Z is sick as hell. Just that fucking design, I love it so much.
It's so good. We're definitely going to talk more in depth about it, especially with how some of its episodes kind of deal a lot more with like adapting plots from the manga of all things, more so than anything from the anime itself, which kind of shows the shift that started to happen with the Mazinger franchise, obviously because of Toei and Go Nagai kind of parting ways from ever since the 70s, that like things in terms of tone from here on out are going to start resembling more of what you would have seen Go Nagai put into like the pages of a comic. It did also have a follow-up film, Mazinger Z versus the Great General of Darkness. Huh, sounds familiar. I imagine it won't go nearly as bad for Koji this time as it did back in the 70s.
Oh.
But then other things after that, we got Shin Mazinger Shogeki Zihen, an anime from 2009 directed by the GOAT Yasuhiro Imagawa, G Gundam and Giant Robo fame, a modern retelling of the Mazinger Z story with a lot more influence taken from Go Nagai's original manga and other stories of his. Like, this is, I think, the first instance in Mazinger's history I think you could point to where it takes a lesson from Violence Jack, where Violence Jack onwards, Go Nagai became extremely fond of recycling characters from all of his past works and having them show up as like similar characters that, or more or less the exact same characters in their own series, but they aren't the main character. I guess one thing I can actually kind of get into briefly is that Violence Jack has an actual human version of Mazinger Z. His name is Jim Mazinger. I know that name sounds like I'm making a shit post, but that's real.
It's real. We are,
and the way that he comes up with it is actually really fucking cool.
How did he come up with it?
So the way it works is that Jim Mazinger is blind, and little kid version of Koji Kabuto rides on his shoulders, basically acting as his pilot. Because as we know in the original series, it's like Mazinger's indestructible and powerful, but his power only comes from Koji being able to pilot him. If you separate the two, they're worthless. So you basically get like an arc of Violence Jack where you do get to see Jim Mazinger, who is a blind African-American martial artist with this little Japanese boy riding on his shoulders, barking out commands for like where to move and where to hit. And it's real fucking cool. It's one of the few highlights of Violence Jack for me personally, since it is a franchise that is otherwise, I'd say, a bit too indulgent on the ultra violence, even for me.
Yeah, it's a little much. Like, I think Go Nagai could have toned it down a little for that one.
Also, an important thing I think that should be mentioned about Shin Mazinger Z is that it does go by a different name in its like international distribution. It's Mazinger Edition Z, which I find to be like such a lamer title.
Yeah.
And it's also like, we've known this as Shin Mazinger Z for so long that it feels more natural to call it that way. Especially because the next subsequent entry is a manga called Shin Mazinger Zero that entered publication the same time as Shin Mazinger anime itself. It's a much different version of the story, a lot darker as well. Like, Shin Mazinger Z, just to like give you another tease for what it's about when we do that episode, is like, it leads more into the god angle of Mazinger Z, I would say. The more mythological, heroic like interpretation of it. Mazinger Zero, meanwhile, leans more into the devil side of it and shows it as the absolute destroyer of all worlds. It gets kind of grimdark, a bit excessively so in some spots. But it's also like, oh, it's so fucking cathartic and amazing to get through and just see characters overcoming like the horrible fate that would come if Mazinger was to unleash its full power and kill everyone.
Yeah, as the day of recording, I have not actually read the manga yet, but I'm extremely excited to do that.
Only warning I will give you before you start is to just power through the first few chapters. That's all I'm going to say.
I'll keep.
It's because in most other situations it would probably be a huge turnoff if the entire manga was like that, but fortunately not. It does have a follow-up manga as well, with another familiar title, like, stop me if you've heard this before, Shin Mazinger Z versus the Great General of Darkness. We won't really, when we do that episode, we're not really going to cover the sequel manga, just because the first half of the story, the regular Mazinger Z manga itself, is already so dense with stuff to talk about that I think it's like, us talking about it will do more than enough to convince you whether or not you should read it as well as its sequel. Because there's no point really talking about a sequel if we're not also going to like give you sufficient background on what came before. Let's see, and as we're wrapping things up, we got Majin Kaiser's Skull, a sequel OVA from 2010 that has no story relation to the original Majin Kaiser, but that's okay because this version of Majin Kaiser is way fucking cooler.
Okay, so some of the shows we're going to talk about have some depth to them. They have some meaning to them. There is no depth or meaning to Mazinger Skull. It is just fucking cool for the sake of being cool.
Yeah, you want to see fucking giant robots like beating the shit out of each other, the heavy metal? This is for you.
Yeah, this is just a heavy metal show.
It even takes some inspiration from Violent Jack in like some regards, not so much in the ultra violence, but at least in terms of like some of the setup for like, I guess, the core conceit of the plot and like why all this fighting is happening, especially with its pilots in particular being significantly more psychotic. Like, these are Mazinger protagonists that would feel right at home in something like Get a Robo.
I was about to say they're more like the manga Get a Robo pilots than Koji.
Definitely. There was also like a manga and novel that expands on events of like this entire setting, but like it's very difficult to find any translations or good translations of it. So really, a lot of what it's known best for is the OVA itself. 3 episodes. You put them all together, it's basically a feature-length movie, and it is awesome.
You can get through it in like an afternoon.
It's worth every minute. And speaking of films, there's an actual film on this list, Mazinger Z Infinity, a 2017 anime movie that celebrates the 50th anniversary of Go Nagai's career, and by extension, the 45th anniversary of Mazinger Z's creation. And the important thing to note is that after the past few entries we briefly went over, how they're like a lot more in line with kind of Go Nagai's takes on like on the story itself. This is the first one after so long where it actually goes back to like the Toei side of the franchise. Like, this is actually a sequel that takes place, like, I believe it's 10 years after the events of Great Mazinger. So it's basically showing how it's like, after the events of those original anime, the characters have grown up. The world is in a prosperous state never before seen, until, oh wait, Dr. Hell returns to enact one final plan to take over the universe, and Koji must pilot Mazinger Z once more to stop it. Like, it is very much a huge send-up to fans of the original Toei anime, that it's like, even then, if you're not that deep into those original anime, kind of like we are, we're not that like deep into every episode of it, it's like, it's still a fun watch, especially because of one fight scene in particular that I would say is the absolute best demonstration of Mazinger Z's creativity in fight scenes. Like, the thing we talked about very early on in this episode about how it's not just the quantity of attacks, it's the way that Mazinger uses them that makes it so exciting to watch every time.
Yeah, it's worth it just for that one fight scene. And I just want to say, the moment the music hits, I just leapt out of my chair and I was cheering. I was like, yes, I'm here for this moment.
I was passionately screaming every single attack name as Koji was doing so. I am that kind of fan.
Hell yeah. I'm there with you, bro.
And lastly, we got one final subsequent entry, which is even more recent than Mazinger Z Infinity, if you can believe it. And that is Grendizer U, a 2024 anime celebrating the 50th anniversary of the original UFO Robo Grendizer. To kind of get back to how much of a big deal Grendizer is in Saudi Arabia, like, we kind of know how a lot of money that is getting funded to certain projects is like coming from like firms in Saudi Arabia because they're huge fans of it. Yeah, no shit that like we're seeing a huge resurgence in popularity in Grendizer because people with a lot of money and influence in that country realize that they can bring back all the shit that they loved as a kid, and that includes Goldorak.
Yeah. By the way, this is probably the only anime I've ever seen that doesn't have an official English translation, but it does have an Arabic translation to it.
Technically, there's an official English like sub for it. Like you can like view it online, but like it's not well done. It is very clearly like because of like how limited the distribution is outside Japan. It is very clearly something where like the international distribution is handled by an Arabic company, which is why it has Arabic subtitles. And I presume for the people that understand the language that I imagine it like reads a lot better to them than the official English subs read to people like me.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
But that's okay because some brave souls actually put together better English translation for it. So you can actually watch it now. You just have to sail the high seas in order to get it. But it's a cool retelling, a modern retelling of the Grendizer story, and also has like a lot more tied to Mazinger than you would expect, considering how tertiary Mazinger as a whole feels in the original Grendizer story. Like Koji is so involved to the point that he is the best bro anyone could ever want out of a friend, and to the point where I would say, fuck Rubina. Koji and Duke are like that's the real relationship right there.
Well, this is also on the list of things I need to watch, so I'm excited to see that as well now.
Yeah, like you're at least familiar with how like kind of whenever Koji was present in the original Grendizer that the relationship between him and like Duke, between Daisuke, was somewhat antagonistic.
Yep.
Just because it's like it's the former hero having to deal with like, you know, the new hero taking his place. That's not a focus in this. This is very much bros helping out other bros.
Hell yeah, I'm here for bros.
Like it is the best example of how it's like, man, Koji as a person really has come a long way since the 70s.
Yeah, he's definitely chilled a little more.
Very positive, affirming. It's like you remember that meme of like where it's like the one scrawny kid on the laptop, and then there's like the other three like muscle-bound bodybuilder dudes with their own laptops, and they're very politely and like answering questions for like this kid, like trying to like give him very positive, affirming life advice. I feel like there's a version of that where it is like one of those muscled up dudes is just Koji, because that's very much him in Grendizer U.
I'm into this Koji. I like this Koji a lot. The support of Koji. He's like, yeah, I'm here for you, brother.
This is the friend I've wanted all along. So that's it. That's pretty much everything you need to know about the grand world of Mazinger and like its effect on this entire genre of mecha.
Yeah.
Like, oh my god, that was so much to get
There
through.
was a lot. Like I hope we got across like how important this show actually was, or this whole like property and like the impact it made on everything after. Because we wouldn't have a lot of shit without this show.
And it still gets new stuff made for it even to this day. Like, it's still featured in Super Robot Wars. There are still plenty of new, like action figures or like super collectible figures that get made. Some of it based on stuff that exists in these in these properties, in these series that we have mentioned, while others are like completely original, unique takes on it that only exist in figure form.
Yeah.
And like the fact that it has continued even to the point where 2024, the year that we're recording this for the purpose of the backlog, is like, that is this recent. Mazinger's never going to go away, even after Go Nagai eventually passes from this world, which he still has not, and I am glad for that. I hope he continues to lead as much of a long, healthy life the same way that Mel Brooks has.
I agree. And yeah, like I do not see Mazinger ever going away. It will live on to infinity.
I think that there's a good way to describe kind of like how like its lasting impact and like its legacy is such that it will never go away, even if it's not at the forefront of people's mind and pop culture. Think of it in the same way as how like every now and then you still see like new stuff come out with like Scooby-Doo, for instance, you know, something that is like, again, from a very similar time than Mazinger came out in, or like Hanna-Barbera properties or whatnot. There's still going to be enough people that like remember those when they were new and like put out new stuff that on a good day will either be super like respectful of the original property, make something better of it, or on a worse day you get shit like Velma.
Thankfully,
not much more needs to be said about that part, but you get the idea. It's the fact that it's like there's always going to be people that remember it because it happened so long ago, and like was so popular enough that it's seated in like those roots, those deep roots for like generations to come.
Yeah.
So I think with that said, we can definitely wrap up this episode. So it was so much fun just getting to like break down all this cool shit, like all the historical influence, all the theorizing, especially with like my ideas of how like the Gekiga movement like kind of potentially had like a parallel impact to Mazinger taking off the way that it did. Just the ever increasing drive for audiences and creators to want more dramatic stories out of what are essentially cartoons for kids. And now it's like we've got a whole bunch of different cartoons and comics and shit that like run the whole gamut of being like for all ages, and others that are clearly for weird sicko adults like us.
Yeah, it's made for us. This is the show that the target is us, and I love them for it. Yeah, I just had a lot of fun just talking about these shows, just because, you know me, I love me some giant robots. But even if I don't love the original show, I have so much respect for it and just the legacy it has. And also, like, some of the Mazinger related media is some of my favorite animes, especially Shin Mazinger. And that's a show that I can't wait to talk about, and talk about how much it breaks my heart.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's that's for another day for sure.
That is another thing.
But we still got a few other things on our list to get through. Mainly the other big franchises that deserve this same level of a deep dive to kind of give you the sense of like what the broad scope is. Because if what we talked about with all these subsequent entries for the Mazinger franchise and like what it's had from the 70s, if you think this is big.
Oh boy,
get ready for when we have to talk about Gundam next week.
You all have no idea how deep the Gundam well goes. It's...
Oh, yeah.
You've heard all the shows we talked about. Just triple that for Gundam.
This was as lightning round as we could get when we started talking about the subsequent entries. We're going to have to be, like, even faster when we get to, like, talking about all the extra shit that came out after the original 79 Gundam.
Oh, yeah. That'll
be for next time.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Neff, for being on.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone at home, for listening. Tune in next time as we'll talk about the rise of the real robot, the birth of Mobile Suit Gundam. Catch you all then.
I hope you all have a good day.
まだ出すんだブレストファイヤーマジンゴー